Hello and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another Historical Humans Reacts. And on a continuation from Saturday's episode, we are going to be talking about putting ethics at the forefront of the use of human skeletal remains. The topic of using skeletal remains in science and in research has really become a forefront on the academic arguments. It has become a huge to-do about the ethicalness and the beliefs behind utilizing human remains for scientific research. Last week, we talked about some of the conditions that animal remains are in, but this week, we're going to be talking about the actual study of human remains and some of the ethics behind it,
Yeah.
which is
Oh,
very
yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah. No. Traditionally, human remains have been put under a myriad of circumstances for the purpose of education, science, and or public interest, from display pieces at museums to cadavers being dissected to teach medical students. Um, Even the traditional image of the dangling skeleton in the classroom, traditionally, that was a human skeleton someone rammed pieces of metal through to hold upright. It wasn't a plastic, that we see today. So there's a long tradition of really doing some pretty interesting things to people's bodies that you wouldn't want having done to yourself.
It poses a very fascinating question because throughout human history, remains have always been this kind of macabre topic, this dark story. And in the past, human remains used to be very prominently displayed if you were an enemy of the king or an enemy of the courts. And then it transitioned to a more research focused area where you talk about, yeah, a lot of classes had actual real human skeletons in the corner hung up so you could view the body. And then you had other institutions that would have a large amount of human remains and they would do comparative analysis, sometimes for not always the best purpose. Mainly talking about eugenics, sadly enough, because they would compare human skeletons to try and find which version was superior. The real truth to that is there really isn't a difference. We are all the same species. But it led to a lot of these large collections of human remains. A lot of research is destructive in nature. One of the main methods of doing analysis on human remains includes laser ablation, which basically will completely ablate a piece of human remains and turn it into plasma so that they can find the chemical composition. This is good for carbon and nitrogen analysis to analyze diet. You could do the same with teeth to see where they were originally born because, fun fact, your body represents the chemical composition of where you were born. And that is shown through your teeth because they're developed early on. Your bones change every few years because of the regenerative process. So your bones don't always match your teeth, and that's a way we could tell people moved over large distances. And honestly, I always think of the Muter Museum in Philadelphia. Fun shout out. Because they have one of the largest collections of human remains of any museum in the world.
Yeah. And one of the key issues brought up here with this article regarding human remains and their curation and collection is that a lot of them are treated as scientific experiments and curiosities rather than the remnants of human beings. And there's a push going now to shift that perspective, to really acknowledge that this is a person we're putting on display, a person who had no real say in this and probably had no intent of ever being here. So, how do we work with it? How do we advocate for someone? Does your voice cease to matter once you cease to physically have a voice?
And a lot of those arguments too stem from a lot of indigenous communities in North America and a lot of indigenous communities around the world because a lot of times during colonial periods they became the topic of fascination of study, and they were oftentimes studied or analyzed or subjected to these experiments without their consent. So it became a very touchy topic and something that really began to change, I'd say, in the 90s. I mean, the United States implemented the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. However, NAGPRA wasn't really well enforced. It was a great law in the basis of it, but it didn't have any sort of enforcement arm. This was until very recently when the former Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, sent out a memo to try and get museums and institutions to fully comply. And we've talked about that before on previous videos, where a lot of museums would just completely cut off entire sections of their museums while they tried to figure out and ascertain whether or not it was, one, a cultural item associated with a specific group, and two, if it was a burial good. So it's one of those things where ethics really do need to be the forefront and basis of our work, especially so we can prevent future eugenics studies.
And even without the eugenics, the majority of the human remains in a lot of these collections come from marginalized communities. They come from populations that couldn't really advocate or push back hard enough to stop the institutions from taking the remains, experimenting on them, and displaying them. These are, these are racial and ethnic minorities. These are religious minorities. These are the poor. This is very exploitative in how these collections came to be. And anthropology and archaeology really needs to start wrestling with that question sooner rather than later.
And it's something where it really does need to become a priority. And one of the things that they talk about is to set clear guidelines for collection, curation, and use of human remains. And a lot of times the argument in the United States becomes very extreme very quickly, where people say, well, we're not going to be able to do any study. And that's not exactly true. That's a straw man argument, in my opinion, where they're just saying, well, what about this? And it becomes more whataboutism than anything else, when in reality, a lot of tribes want questions answered too, and they're willing to support that research. So it's all about research design, in my opinion. How can you get your research topic covered with consent of the groups who are in charge or who may have a shoe in the fight? We don't think about it necessarily the same as a lot of groups do, where to them, it doesn't matter how many generations separate it. That's still grandma over there, Yep. Whereas in Europe, they kind of go, "Oh, that was 300 years ago. That person doesn't matter."
Yep.
Throw them in the ossuary.
Yeah, or even just the person does matter, but the concept of how respect is displayed is different. There's a lot of key things of that. Like I've been to Greece and I saw them openly display dead from 1,000 years ago, from 3,000 years ago, just in public. And it was seen as almost an honor. Like this was a symbol of how long they had been there as a people, was this person's remains, held up as a sort of triumph.
And then one of the last pieces of this article that I think is important to note is a lot of these remains were collected in the 19th and 20th centuries using means that we would consider unethical. During the late 19th century, there was a very common trend, especially in the United States, known as grave robbing or body snatching, where you would go look for the fresh dirt in the ground and basically dig up the body and sell it off downriver for a pot of gold. You would just trade it and get money for the remains, and that was an actual thriving business.
Yeah, that practice was so prevalent in Europe and the Americas that it was a major theme inspiring Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Frankenstein's monster is pieced together from human remains that have been grave robbed.
And part of this stems from the medical sciences, because a lot of times to study medicine, you needed a cadaver or remains to study on. This led to a fun urban legend of sorts, it is accurate, it is true, but there's a house that Benjamin Franklin lived in London, where they found like 13 skeletons buried in the basement. And they believe it's tied to the fact that Franklin studied medicine and was actively studying when he was in London.
Yep.
Do we think Benjamin Franklin buried the bones in the basement? It's probable.
Yeah. Possession of the body wasn't exactly legal.
As long as you weren't the one doing the shoveling. But I think that's probably a great point for us to wrap up on this episode. Thank you guys for watching. Let us know your thoughts down below, and we'll see you in the next one.